Before we begin, here's how to earn continuing professional education credit for attending this session. Gain valuable insights by attending the podcast, then complete the assessment test to download your certificate. To do this, follow these simple steps. Click on the link in your description to access the session. Create a free account and attend the podcast. After the podcast, take the assessment test and download your certificate. It's easy, and it's free. We highly recommend checking out our subscription. Let's get started.
So essentially what you're trying to say is that AI does the heavy lifting by performing the preliminary calculations and spotting the anomalies before you even begin an analysis. Is that how it is?
You got it. 100%. So the idea is we're using AI to auto-curate data lakes for auditors.
Right.
So ahead of the audit, and this is a new role we think is going to end up being, and this role already exists inside of a lot of audit firms, but it's the clerks that take the data from the client end. So how do I organize the data coming in from the client?
Yep.
Okay. And then how do I structure it in the data lake around the areas of risk that we've identified from the structured financial data? And it can be very simple tests, like it could be a days sales outstanding report says, I've got some clients that don't seem to be paying up. That's an area of risk. And I want to look at all the documentation associated with the customers that aren't making their payments. And that's, a valid audit risk. To go reach out and say, I would like the documentation in this area for these kind of products that you're selling to these customers. And, that's what builds data lakes, is knowing that there's areas of risk, there's linkages to the documentation, the business process flow, source documentation in that area. How does it link to the transaction? Okay, now we're seeing why things weren't paid. And now you're learning that, maybe you've over-invoiced somebody or something like that.
Welcome to today's episode of We're Trying to Figure Out. I'm your host, Saul, and today we are diving into how artificial intelligence is reshaping the world of auditing. Joining us today is John Craig, CEO of Vigilant AI, a leading company helping firms streamline their financial data management and audit processes through AI. John, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Saul. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. John, you've been in this space for quite some time, and you've seen firsthand how technology can transform the audit process. But before we jump into the tech, can you give us a bit of your background? What led you to create Vigilant AI?
So really interesting journey for me. I mean, I'm not an accountant by training at all. I'm an engineer. I spent most of my early career in telecom, and I actually delved into some areas that had to do with network management. So it was large data management. It was managing how telecom networks stored their inventories, and we had to figure out how big networks used to be able to have to activate things like DSL over a series of connections, and you had to know whether the network had that kind of connection to the endpoint to be able to, say, enable a DSL connection back in the day.
Yep.
And it was actually with telecoms, it was a big data problem because they had very complex plants and they didn't know what exactly was on every line that they had out there in the world as to whether they could roll these services out. So I got exposed to some big data problems. But as I moved through my career, I ended up getting involved in entrepreneurism and starting some companies in some interesting areas, including like mobile app development, stuff like that. And after selling out of one of my companies, I ended up getting into a company in the Ottawa area called MindBridge Artificial Intelligence, or MindBridge AI. And MindBridge was using artificial intelligence to do financial anomaly detection. So that was kind of my first exposure to the accounting industry. And that's what brought me eventually to found Vigilant AI.
All right, that's interesting. That's fascinating. There is a thought behind it. Vigilant AI is solving some major pain points in the accounting and auditing industry today, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about what problem you identified that led to the creation of Vigilant AI?
Well, the main problem that we identified is that there is no way for an auditor or an accounting firm to be able to manage and review unstructured data.
Mm-hmm.
So unstructured data being like documentary, source document evidence attached to financial transactions. And there was no automated way to go through that data. Nobody had come up with the right approach. There are some techniques that are out there now that use OCR to extract data from documents, but you have to have kind of read the document in advance yourself to know this is the right document, this is the data I want to extract, and then I attach that manually to an Excel spreadsheet. That's
Right.
kind of state of the art in accounting today. But
Mm-hmm.
nobody was automating going through this data. And what we recognized is there's a continuing number of audit failures. There's a continuing number of audit fines that are taking place in the industry. And a lot of it has to do with not being able to review enough data. And my experience when I was at Mindbridge is we've come up with approaches that allow organizations now to review 100% of their structured data, to
Mm-hmm.
get risk scores on 100% of their structured data. So their general ledgers, their account payable subledgers, other pieces. We're able to do that now, but nobody's helping an auditor read documents faster. So that is a huge impediment to audit quality.
Right.
And that is the baseline problem we're actually trying to solve here is improving audit quality, because if you can't read all the documents in a limited time frame of an audit, you can't enhance the quality of the audit.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess that's one of the things that I'm really thankful for the beautiful things that it's doing, reading it, reading the document, summarizing it. I use it a little bit for myself, not really from an audit standpoint, but really helps me get up to speed. So it's really brilliant, really brilliant. So let's talk about those challenges a bit more. You said that there are many firms that still rely heavily on exporting data, then you know uh, you've got all this unstructured data in different forms. There are documents, there are reports in Excel, there are different softwares. There's a lot of manual workflow happening. So and AI is still doing it, and a lot of people want this to coming in. But why is this still so prevalent in the industry? And what problems is this creating for the firms?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of things that take place when you're using Excel
Mm-hmm.
everywhere. And I think the first thing is it's not a very efficient way of transporting information. So, for example, I export data out of an ERP system using Excel. I then load it into my working paper solution in Excel format. I then transform it in my working paper solution, normalizing some of that data from the ERP's format into a more auditable view, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, when I need to perform analysis, I'm exporting it out and taking it into, say, a risk assessing tool or an analytics program, again by Excel. And then I'm
Mm-hmm.
bringing it back in, and then I'm attaching documents to it in Excel and loading it back up into the working paper solution. As a result, we have taken sensitive client data and we've brought it into our organization. We've passed it around to 3 or 4 different SaaS tools that we own, which have their own SOC 2 cloud instances.
Yes.
That data, that client data, is also downloaded onto the desktops of the accounting firms that are doing, and then spread throughout the accounting firms' systems. So you are getting or creating or opening the door to a security nightmare, because none of this data is centralized in a single repository. You don't know how it's necessarily been transformed, but you got reports that are all over the place. It tells you how it's been transformed. but where can you bring everything together? And that's why we focus on this concept of intelligent data management. And
Okay.
intelligent data management is an approach that we believe the accounting industry is moving towards very rapidly, where you're going to have a centralized repository that is a data lake. And
Mm-hmm.
that data lake is going to have all the structured and unstructured data, as well as all of the meta notation of what has happened to that data as it's moved through the audit process. So you have a single, authenticated record of what has happened and what you've found from that organization. And if some other application needs to get access to that data, it does it through structured APIs.
Oh, very interesting. Well, you mentioned data lake, and I'm shortly going to come back on that. But there's this manual data processes. I mean, we see this day in, day out, even for firms that have introduced adoption of AI. The manual processes still continue to be there, and we all know it that it's got a lot of inefficiencies. It brings a lot of inefficiencies in the audit process. But you've been doing this and you've been advocating this that why this needs to stop. So I would want you to let our readers know the hidden risks and costs associated with this outdated workflows of manual data processes.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the security risk that I just outlined, I mean, the speed at which work can be done is limited by how many documents an accountant or an auditor or an analyst can read
Mm-hmm.
during the appropriate audit window. And as I said, when you're able to judge risk on structured financial data very rapidly, very quickly, the quality of your audit is then going to suffer by the number of high-risk transactions you're able to dig into. And based on the business processes that underlie those transactions, whether it's revenue, whether it's payables, whether it's shareholders, documentation, or other things, expert's got to come and read that documentation and link it to be able to validate the transactions that have taken place. And that takes a while. And whether that is lease accounting or, as I said, it's revenue as an area of risk, there's an awful lot of documentations, awful lot of, say, legal clauses and other things in there. And we need to find ways to automate this because we're not testing enough of it. And we have the tools now in hand to be able to automate the testing of the transactions and their source documentation to see if there is the congruence and alignment that actually validates the transaction or not.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, because you're talking about data validation, I I have to know your views on. I mean, this was a very early thought. I'm not sure where this thought stands, but somebody did come up with this idea of using blockchain, in the audit process. But I mean, but I know you have some views to share of it. Can you share why you
I
think blockchain isn't the best solution?
Yeah, so I'm not a big fan of the blockchain because of the expense to perform authentication.
Yeah.
And I think the blockchain also lacks something that is really important in the authentication of data, which is context.
Okay.
So what we've decided to focus on as the most important thing for context in risk assessing a transaction is what was the underlying business process? What
Right.
was the business process in the documentation that led to this transaction? Okay.
Gotcha.
So let's talk about a simple case like revenue. All right.
Okay.
You got revenue, you've got a legal agreement, which is a master services agreement that says, I'm going to provide services or something to you. The customer then issues POs, there's receipts, there's invoices, but then there's a whole ton of other context which could be brought into the conversation. I'm not advocating for enriching the audit process today with some of this additional data, but think of bringing in emails between your sellers and your customers and being able to see the back and forth around price and other things. So, or confrontations that take place on clauses that you have in legal agreements that either you or your client didn't live up to, and that's going to have impact on what those transactions are all about down the road. So we look at information, not only information standardized inside the ERP, but think of your data lake as being able to access any of the information outside of the ERP as well. That isn't necessarily email's just a big bold example. There are other ones out there like inventory management systems and other things where you could be bringing data into the system and getting a better view on that business process that has led to that transaction. And that's really the power of data lakes, is being able to not only look at the data, but the context of the data authenticates it in its own right, because certain things happen. And
Yes.
if certain documents don't get produced,
Yeah.
that process looks a little odd.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now let's pivot to how AI is actually solving some of these challenges, right? At Vigilant AI, you use machine learning to capture, contextualize, and analyze all this financial data. So, but I would definitely want our listeners to know, how does that process work?
Do you want to earn CPE credit? Take this course of My CPE to earn free credit. Click the link in the description to get started.
Well, let's just talk about the big picture of intelligent data management and what that means, because we're just one way of doing it.
Okay.
Our approach is very much focused, or the approach to intelligent data management is to scan documents, okay, using OCR techniques.
Yep.
And you can use a variety of AI approaches as well. But
Yep.
what you want to have is you want to have an auditor in the loop, okay? So what you're doing is you're scanning documentation, you're linking it based on the business process to various transactions. And once that documentation is linked to the transaction, you're able to then, in an intelligent data management fashion, automate the testing of extracted terms out of the documents,
Okay.
okay, against the structured financial data or across the business process documentation. So you could look at clauses, you could pull a legal clause out of let's say you pull a legal clause out of a master services agreement, which says you can't short ship me or I get a 10% discount. Well, you can design a test in the system that says this happened. Oh, I have a bill of lading over here that says you short ship me. So you owe me this as a credit. And we can put a package together, send it to the client, and they get that credit back. So the concept of intelligent data management is extracting terms, turning them into tests, and then building the report structure out so that you can actually send and get it either from an enterprise side or a consulting side, or in the audit world, say, hey, look, you've left some money on the table here over here. Your balance should be different with your client and customer because you've failed to, extract value from your contracts, as it were.
Right. And now I'm just gonna, move your conversation back to the term that you said, data lake. And
Yeah.
there is one more term that I hear, there is data lakes, and then there is data swamps. That's a word that I've heard as well. So can you explain how audit firms can prevent the data lakes from turning into data swamps? Obviously, also let everybody know what is a data swamp, because
Yeah, so data swamps. So the audit industry has dabbled in data lakes in the past.
right.
We've used some of the earlier tools that came out, whether it was Hadoop or Splunk
Mhm.
or other tools that were out there in the world. And what happens is you load your unstructured data and your structured data into this repository.
Okay.
Now, if you don't, and this comes back to the point about context, if you don't have a context for bringing all this data together and a test or an automation you want to run on all that data, it very quickly descends into what we call a data swamp.
Mhm.
Because what we want to use is the context of the business process to create essentially the metadata schema that links everything together,
Gotcha.
right?
Gotcha.
And that's what the important thing is about context. So a good data lake is tagged so that there is a chain of all the correct documentation and an understanding, sort of a taxonomy almost, of how it connects to the financial transactions, to the structured financial data. And that allows it to be searchable, produce useful reporting results, to be able to look at things at a point, like look at one transaction, look at all the documentation associated with it, or look across a series of data on a 12-month basis and see, has there been an anomaly in either the structured or unstructured data that would point out that something has gone wrong.
Oh, that's interesting. That makes actually a lot of sense. So essentially what you're trying to say is that AI does the heavy lifting by performing the preliminary calculations and spotting the anomalies before you even begin an analysis. Is that how it is?
You got it. 100%. So the idea is we're using AI to auto curate data lakes for auditors.
Right.
So ahead of the audit, and this is a new role we think is going to end up being, and this role already exists inside of a lot of audit firms, but
Mm-hmm.
it's the clerks that take the data from the client end. So how do I organize the data coming in from the client?
Yep.
Okay. And then how do I structure it in the data lake around the areas of risk that we've identified from the structured financial data? And it can be very simple tests, like it could be a days sales outstanding report says, I've got some clients that don't seem to be paying up. That's an area of risk. And I want to look at all the documentation associated with the customers that aren't making their payments. And that's, a valid audit risk to go reach out and say, I would like the documentation in this area for these kind of products that you're selling to these customers. And, that's what builds data lakes, is
Mm-hmm.
knowing that there's areas of risk, there's linkages to the documentation, the business process flow, source documentation in that area. How does it link to the transaction? Okay, now we're seeing why things weren't paid. And now you're learning that, maybe you've over invoiced somebody or something like that. So there was a fat finger invoice and they're not going to pay it because, uh, you charged them double what they said you were going to in the contract or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And obviously, AI is also able to extract that information from the contract, match it to the invoices, and tell you upfront that this is the reason why.
Or the number doubled
Yeah.
because, the customer put a change order in.
Oh,
And where
yeah.
did change orders end up? Well, do they make it into the ERP system all the time? Sometimes they don't. Maybe they're in an email. And
Yeah.
that's where I come back to. It's other sources of data that you can bring in outside of the ERP system to say, yeah, that contract doubled because of this. And now we're in an email dispute
Yeah.
over whether that work was done validly or not, and was it signed off by the right people. So
Wow. Wow. Very interesting. Very interesting. I wish I could see this really live in action, but maybe we'll keep that for some other, podcast or something. But let's dive deeper into how AI is helping with the accuracy in audits, right? So how does it help the auditors detect the anomalies or discrepancies that might otherwise be missed during manual audits?
well, the beauty is with all the main thrust of AI is that it can automate a lot of testing in advance. So
Mm-hmm.
even before an audit begins, you can have positioned your data, knowing the areas of risk in the organization, knowing the documentation that you brought in, knowing the taxonomy. Okay, now I'm picking fields out of certain documents and comparing them against the structured financial data or against all of the documents in the process from PO, receipt, invoice, master service agreement, checksums, all the way across the way. I'm looking at it in two-dimension format. And I'm coming up with reports that tell me, oh, I've tested and the revenue in these two documents is different. The proposal said I should have been paying this much, and I have an invoice that says double.
Oh,
Now, why? And you
yeah.
look at it and you go, oh, the AI can figure out this says quantity two, this says quantity one. Quantity one was what was ordered. You gave them quantity two. let's figure out what the problem is,
It's
right?
something in the email.
So we want to draw auditors' attention to when, they've selected a risky transaction for review. We can draw attention to the documentation that we've identified in advance at risk. So it
Gotcha.
allows them to focus in, but not just to the document, to the field level inside the document that has the evidence.
Right.
So our hero screen inside this process is showing the auditor a failed test.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Revenue in an invoice doesn't equal revenue in a purchase order.
Gotcha.
Two documents side by side with boxes around the value. So they can immediately validate
Nice.
that the machine, the OCR, extracted the right term out of that document. Because there's a percentage chance that the data that's been extracted from the document was wrong or missing. So having that screen and drawing attention to that is very important, but also to the validation exercise that has to go on to transactions that were thumbs up in the sample solid. So here's a set of solid transactions. We can also pre-validate a lot of documentation and testing, and that creates a more solid foundation to move forward on. So it's
Wow.
not just finding the anomalies, it's also increasing the validation exercise that takes place during an audit to say we validated perhaps, in the areas of risk we identified, we validated 100% of the documentation to have been done correctly, or to have extracted terms correctly for review, rather. Yeah. So it's about finding out how well their documentation processes are running as well. We can basically score companies on all kinds of dimensions as to whether the business process documentation is keeping track with the way they've recorded the transactions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things we discussed was the need for standardization of data management.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain why standardization is crucial for accounting firms today?
Well, I think it's one of the biggest factors in why audits have data issues in general. Now, this is again a bias of mine. I come from the telecom industry. And in the core of the telecom network, all the components that make your cell phone work are based on standardized data schemas as the way they store, manipulate, and manage data from a billing perspective, from a customer record perspective. It's very similar to the insides of accounting organizations, the way telecoms operate, but they standardize the way that they store and manage their data. So if you want to replace the database inside of a core cellular network, you take out the Huawei component, you put the Ericsson component in, and it works just fine, right? Because it's all standardized data interfaces.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's not the way it works in the accounting industry. It's a self-regulated profession. ERPs that don't use standardized interfaces that export into formats that are hard to or difficult to load into other systems. That kind of standardization just doesn't exist in accounting the same way it does in the cellular network. And that leads to an inefficiency that, we note because every audit seems to have different aspects to it. I'm not even going to get into the side of the benchmarking side of the world where you're, looking at different industries and pieces. But there have been standards proposed in accounting for more machine readable formatting, XBRL being a great example of one out there. It would be really neat if all the ERP systems were able to use a common language, readable, machine readable and human readable for exchanging information back and forth that wasn't Excel. And that's where that's the struggle I think the accounting industry and the ERP industry is going to go through in the next few years, because what AI is going to do is it's going to point out, well, AI can adapt to doing this, it's expensive to adapt it to doing this. And people are going to realize really quick, well, why am I paying for this high performance computing when I could have just built a better schema and been a lot more efficient? And
Gotcha.
that's what's that AI eventually points out, that because it's going to hit you in the pocketbook, because if you're using Gen AI, I'll give you an example here, which is
Yes.
great. If you
Yes.
use Gen AI to extract data out of a document, it's like going into Starbucks, okay, and ordering, a frothy mocha frappuccino with, all kinds of peppermint in it. It's
Mhm.
going to cost you $8. But what you really needed was the bean, one coffee bean out of that document. I needed one number out of there. It's a very expensive way to extract data out of documents. So coming up with efficient processes to do it and feeding them into schemas that are efficient, that's going to also save the accounting industry a significant amount of compute down the road. Because if we just lean on Gen AI to tear documents apart for us, we are in a heap load of expense very, very quickly. And audit and accounting firms are on the cusp of finding out what, 30, 40, $50,000 bills for compute in an audit if some junior level employee runs off and uses ChatGPT for everything.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE's Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.
Well, let's not talk about ChatGPT. In fact, I guess the news today morning is OpenAI is actually coming up with a new version, which
Yeah.
is also going to have some reasoning capabilities, but too early to test that, too early to talk on it. But we'll talk about you. You have worked with so many clients, and I'm sure you have got a lot of transformation stories to share. But could you share an example of how audit has transformed an audit process for one of your clients?
I think one of the areas has that we've identified with one of our clients is a return on investment.
Okay, interesting.
So it's significant in terms of labor reduction. So the audit industry today is obviously facing labor shortage challenges. And in certain areas of audit, I'll give you an example. This is a grant reconciliation or a grant compliance audit. Okay. So in government, very often governments take a grant, they send it out to a not-for-profit. There's a bunch of rules and regulations about that. Those
Yep.
form the tests of
Yes.
what we're supposed to do. So we code tests into our system, load all the documentation at the end of the month brought in for the not-for-profits, and we scan through against a set of rules, and the rules are enshrined in tests. So for example, there could be a rule that at the end of a month, all the reports have to be submitted with a signature from the managing director on a particular on the 15th day of the month.
Okay.
Of course, the 15th day of the month sometimes falls on a Sunday.
Yeah.
So it's very often that grantees file a report on a Monday, a
Uh-huh.
day late. But
Well,
you have to the rules say we have to find a signature block and a date, tag it as an exception,
yeah.
check it, tag it as an exception, and then write a report to the governmental entity that says we found an exception in reporting. It was off by a day. Okay. But that is a tedious manual process to do. A computer can automate that like this.
Wow.
So when
Wow.
you have enough of those manual tests that you need to go through
Uh-huh.
inside of an audit, and the way we're structuring the rules, we're able to do this at a price point that is, half the cost of their labor, makes their labor that more productive. So they're able to not just sample. Where we're getting to is the higher quality part that I was talking about before. We're not just sampling certain grantees for review. We're able to do all of the grantees.
Yes. 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 In fact, that is something that I always felt that, sampling is somewhere it's lethal, because what if your sample was itself not a good sample? you know, Like,
Mathematics is a fun way of absolving people. Percentages have a great way of absolving people of crime.
very well said, very well said.
Whole, yeah,
Yeah,
but on the whole, I think the idea is uh, these kind of labor returns that you can get, it makes there's still a human in the loop. I don't want to say I've automated this to the degree that everybody can trust the output. You
no,
come up with some output based on a series of tests. Somebody still has to examine that and say,
yep,
I agree that this machine is done the right work, has been transparent about how it's done it. That's the important thing, and has links back to the documents that I can review.
correct.
So it doesn't look like some of the black box approaches that are out there in the world today
Mm-hmm.
with generative AI and other things that just tell you what the answer is, but don't tell you where they'll point at the document but not the page. You know, you need
The
the
reference.
box and the term
Yeah.
that was pulled out.
Interesting, interesting. But I was talking to this other lady called Jodie Potter who was talking about the value pricing model, and she happened to talk on AI because somebody asked her this question during one of her speeches that they use AI for doing something, all right, and then they are like, this is what we charge per hour, but AI did it for us in 2 seconds or 10 seconds. So do I charge them for 10 seconds? So she was like, oh my God, I mean, but at the end of the day, they're missing out on the point which you rightly pointed out. That at the end of the day, there needs to be a human at the end who is actually analyzing that to make sure that it's doing and giving the results that's intended to give, you know. So that's very rightly pointed out. And I also see that this actually opens up a lot of opportunities of services that firms can offer, but I guess it's just not seeing this. But if you were to say, like, what do you think? What are the new client service opportunities do you think AI will create for the accounting firms?
Or the client, sorry, I couldn't catch that. No,
The
the
new
client services.
like new opportunities to serve the clients for the accounting firms.
Yeah, and we center, so as I said before, we're about intelligent data management. We look upon data being the deliverable. So anytime you do a service, whether it's a piece of audit work for a client or something like that, you are enhancing their data and being able to hand it back to them, with the results of the audit baked into it with linkages to their own data as to how they do it. Helps to prepare them, making them think more about what's their audit readiness needs to be the next go around. Because whatever the risks are last year are likely to be the risks that they're going to test again next year. There might be a new set of risks. There might be some shocks to the company or something like that, and certain changes that have occurred. But, by and large, they're going to come in and look at the same things again. They're going to look at revenue, payables,
Yeah,
inventory, right?
absolutely.
So you can prepare better for that. But by also potentially, and the way we look at this is data becomes a deliverable. You hand the data lake back to your client and you say, oh, by the way, you can do this, this, and this with it. And suddenly the client's thinking about, oh, and this gets to, the holy grail of accounting is, can we get to continuous audit? Can we
Yeah,
get to an approach where I am enhancing the client's data, handing it back to them after an audit, and
yeah.
they're able to do other analyses internally
Wow.
because we've mapped out business processes. And as they add and perform more analyses themselves, are we getting a richer data set moving forward
Yep.
where we are constantly looking at, just take a simple thing, as I said before, like day sales outstanding report.
Yep.
What if you're able to drill into a day sales outstanding report, click on a PO number, bring the PO document up, but also bring up the master service agreement and all the invoices and go, okay, pull these terms out of this, plot it on a graph.
Wow.
And well, I've looked at it from a document perspective and then a ledger perspective. Is there any delta between the two of them? No, there isn't. There's nothing at the macro level. Well, what am I getting into at the micro level here? Oh, I'm seeing changes, right?
Wow.
And these terms need to be enforced in the agreement or
Yeah.
however it gets managed. And that's the sophistication of making data the deliverable, is because I've linked all those documents now to the client's uh, transactions. They've got a richer data set that they can move forward with and do more with. So I really do believe in that. And that is sort of part of the ethos of our firm, is to say data is going to be the deliverable in the future.
Wow. Wow. Very well said. Very well said. Data is going to be the deliverable of the future. I'm going to keep a note of that. All right. So, you mentioned about, a lot of people, because with AI, and everybody knows it now, AI is able to, audit a lot of stuff. It's able to read through a lot of documents and give you the results in seconds. And then that is actually a reason why, like a lot of firms are actually afraid to adopt AI into their practice, or probably they just don't know how to start, you know. So if at all if there were firms who were looking to prepare to increase their role of AI in the auditing profession, what advice would you give those firms? Like, what should they first prepare for before they start adopting AI into their day-to-day routine?
I think it's the data. 50% of the problem is data.
Okay.
And having a data management, and we say it should be an intelligent data management architecture inside their firm, centralizing all the data that's going to be used by all the SaaS tools out there in the world, is going to be really important. And
Okay.
it goes beyond simple, just secure transfer of documents between the client and the firm, because we all know those end up getting downloaded to the desktop and then getting back into the security issue. It all gets proliferated about the SaaS tools. But having a centralized, intelligent data management architecture, and then the SaaS tools link in appropriately in the right regions, in the right areas. So when you minimize transit costs, because we all, in our rush to move to the cloud, and everybody's going to move to the cloud. When we get to the cloud, you have to remember you want to minimize the amount of transit cost that you have to do between cloud instances. So certain SaaS products exist in certain areas for certain reasons. And if you start transiting data back and forth between two SaaS tools, you're going to start to accumulate transit costs in data. So how can you minimize that? So it's about building it in an infrastructure that's going to make more sense and perhaps has unified compliance capabilities in it as well. And I think there's a big role for some of the big software componentry out there from companies like Snowflake, for example, or Databricks, bringing a unified environment for structured and unstructured data. And that's something we take to heart as well, because we're ensuring that our products can run in those environments. And that gives them scale, security, SOC 2 status across all cloud domains, not just, the weakest SaaS product is your weakest link in your security. Your entire architecture should run inside of in the right data environment where you can minimize cost and transit. Yeah.
Very interesting. So Vigilant AI, we spoke about, softwares talking with each other through APIs and everything. And, you have kind of created this solution which resolves that, I guess. Everybody's talking from one in a common language. It's all standardized, if I may say. It's all standardized. So just for our viewers, if you could let everybody know Vigilant AI, which are some popular softwares that Vigilant AI is very well syncing with and being used by a lot of the customers and all that.
Well, we designed it. We designed it to be very compatible.
Okay.
We design it with an API infrastructure that anybody could work with. You can also drag and drop spreadsheets into the system. The idea is bring your data as it is. Let the data speak for itself inside the environment. It's the business processes that bring the context to the data for that organization. And that's creating the structure that is the natural construct in which you should look at the data is our founding principle. So it's not about coming with a preconceived notion that you're an oil company, so you should structure your data like this. No, it's what are your business processes? We bring your context as is to the data and then build that data lake, auto curate that data lake in such a way is that we can automate the testing of what's going on the inside of it.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I might be putting you on the spot when I ask you this, but do you really think that we'll eventually see real-time auditing becoming a norm?
I think that's it's a beautiful thought. I think it could be like a stretch goal for any one organization to get to. I think it defeats the purpose of how audit firms understand the value they're bringing to the table today.
Okay.
In the future, to Jody's point, if this work was to take 10 seconds, what's the value of it to the organization? We know there's value there for the organization.
Yes.
And in the know-how and the understanding to be able to do it. And the intelligent application of algorithms and processing power is the advantage these firms are going to be able to do. But it's also the quality level.
Yes.
And I think, when you're talking about value that audit firms are bringing, if you can review more data using AI, and I think this is what has to happen, is the quality bar on the audit goes up to the number of documents and processes that have been reviewed that were identified at risk. So it's going above and beyond the sampling approaches that have, protected the accounting industry due to time constraints, right? You only have a limited window. You can only look at so much. So you write off the rest mathematically as saying, I think extrapolation wise, everything's going to be okay. I looked at some, should be enough. The idea now is let's use automation in a way to enhance quality. Let's reduce what's been increasing the last 5 years, which is audit failures, fines to firms that don't have enough time. They're backdating their audits because they don't have enough time to review all the right components inside the audit window they're given. And that's all to do with the explosion of data. Too much data being produced during business processes, structured and unstructured. It's too much. And we know that audit processes today have reached their limit. And it's only through this automation process that we're headed towards that we're going to be able to tackle the amount of data being produced today.
Well, John, this has been such an insightful conversation. Thank you for walking us through how AI is revolutionizing the financial audits. Where can our listeners learn more about Vigilant AI and the solutions that you provide?
Well, I mean, our website is the easiest way to get in touch with us. So www.vigilant-ai.com.
All right, perfect. All right, and do you if you could just enlighten our users, how is your product priced? Do you have a demo or something like
We have a
that?
full demonstration. We have a couple of videos up that explain little 1-minute explainer videos that explain exactly what we can do for auditors and accountants. We're always ready to be set up to do a live demo and share with folks exactly what it is they can expect from our platform.
That's fantastic. Thank you, John. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank you once again for taking the time to share your knowledge with our audience. As we wrap up, I would like to leave our listeners with a final thought. As we're trying to figure it out, we believe in the power of innovation to push boundaries and transform industries. So wherever you are in your journey, whether you are embracing new technologies or reshaping your firm, keep innovating in everything you do. Until next time, keep striving forward. Cheers.
Access latest and trending CPE courses with my CPE's Unlimited Access subscription. Subscribe now.